Understanding Judaism and Zionism thanks to Israel SHAHAK's book, Jewish History, Jewish Religion, Modern Anti-Semitism, following. It is the modern myth of the Jewish race, of outwardly hidden but supposedly dominant characteristics of the Jews, independent of history, of social role, of anything, which is the formal and most important distinguishing mark of modern anti-Semitism. This was in fact perceived by some church leaders when modern anti-Semitism first appeared as a movement of some strength. Some French Catholic leaders, for example, opposed the new racist doctrine expounded by Edward Drummond, the first popular modern French anti-Semite and author of the notorious book La France Juive, 1886, which achieved wide circulation. Note: the refusal of the Church to admit that once a Jew, always a Jew, was another cause of pain for an ostentatious Catholic like Drummond. One of his chief lieutenants, Jules Guérin, has recounted the disgust he felt when the famous Jesuit Père du Lac remonstrated with him for attacking some converted Jews named Dreyfus. End of note. Early modern German anti-Semites encountered similar opposition. It must be pointed out that some important groups of European conservatives were quite prepared to play along with modern anti-Semitism and use it for their own ends, and the anti-Semites were equally ready to use the conservatives when the occasion offered itself, although at bottom there was little similarity between the two parties. The victims who were most harshly treated by the pen of the above-mentioned Drummond were not the Rothschild, but the great nobles who courted them. Drummond did not spare the royal family, or the bishops, or for that matter, the Pope. Nevertheless, many of the French great nobles, bishops, and conservatives generally were quite happy to use Drummond and anti-Semitism during the crisis of the Dreyfus affair in an attempt to bring down the Republican regime. This type of opportunistic alliance reappeared many times in various European countries until the defeat of Nazism. The conservatives' hatred of radicalism, and especially of all forms of socialism, blinded many of them to the nature of their political bedfellows. In many cases, they were literally prepared to ally themselves with the devil, forgetting the old saying that one needs a very long spoon to sup with him. The effectiveness of modern anti-Semitism and of its alliance with conservatism depended on several factors. First, the older tradition of Christian religious opposition to Jews, which existed in many, though by no means all, European countries, could, if supported or at least unopposed by the clergy, be harnessed to the anti-Semitic bandwagon. The actual response of the clergy in each country was largely determined by specific local, historical, and social circumstances. In the Catholic Church, the tendency for an opportunistic alliance with anti-Semitism was strong in France, but not in Italy. In Poland and Slovakia, but not in Bohemia. The Greek Orthodox Church had notorious anti-Semitic tendencies in Romania, but took the opposite line in Bulgaria. Among the Protestant churches, the German was deeply divided on this issue. Others, such as the Latvian and Estonian, tended to be anti-Semitic, but many, for example the Dutch, Swiss, and Scandinavian, were among the earliest to condemn anti-Semitism. Secondly, anti-Semitism was largely a generic expression for xenophobia, the desire for a pure, homogeneous society. But in many European countries around the 1900, and in fact, until quite recently, the Jew was virtually the only stranger. This was particularly true of Germany. In principle, the German racists of the early 20th century hated and despised blacks just as much as Jews. But there were no blacks in Germany then. Hate is, of course, much more easily focused on the present than on the absent, especially under the conditions of the time when mass travel and tourism did not exist and most Europeans never left their own country in peacetime. Thirdly, the successors of the tentative alliance between conservatism and anti-Semitism were inversely proportional to the power and capabilities of its opponents. And the consistent and effective opponents of anti-Semitism in Europe are the political forces of liberalism and socialism. Historically, the same forces that continue in various ways the tradition symbolized by the War of Dutch Independence, 1561-1648, the English Revolution, and the Great French Revolution. On the European continent, the main shibboleth is the attitude towards the Great Revolution. Roughly speaking, those who are for it are against anti-Semitism. Those who accept it with regret would be at least prone to an alliance with the anti-Semites. Those who hate it and would like to undo its achievements are the milieu from which anti-Semitism develops. Nevertheless, a sharp distinction must be made between conservatives and even reactionaries on the one hand, and actual racists and anti-Semites on the other. Modern racism, of which anti-Semitism is part, although caused by specific social conditions, becomes, when it gains strength, a force that, in my opinion, can only be described as demonic. After coming to power and for its duration, I believe it defies analysis by any presently understood social theory or set of merely social observations, and in particular by any known theory invoking interests, be they class or state interests, or other than purely psychological interests of any entity that can be defined in the present state of human knowledge. But this I do not mean that such forces are unknowable in principle. On the contrary, one must hope that, with the growth of human knowledge, they will come to be understood. But at present they are neither understood nor capable of being rationally predicted, and this applies to all racisms in all societies. Note: Let me illustrate the irrational demonic character which racism can sometimes acquire with 3 examples chosen at random. A major part of the extermination of Europe's Jews was carried out in 1942 and early 1943 during the Nazi offensive in Russia, which culminated in their defeat at Stalingrad. During the 8 months between June 1942 and February 1943, the Nazis probably used more railway wagons to haul Jews to the gas chambers than to carry much needed supplies to the army. Before being taken to their death, most of these Jews, at least in Poland, had been very effectively employed in production of equipment for the German army. The second, rather remote, example comes from a description of the Sicilian Vespers in 1282. Every Frenchman they met was struck down. They poured into the inns frequented by the French and the houses where they dwelt, sparing neither man nor woman nor child. The rioters broke into the Dominican and Franciscan convents, and all the foreign friars were dragged out and told to pronounce the word chichiri, whose sound the French tongue could never accurately reproduce. Anyone who failed in the task was slain. The third example is recent. In the summer of 1980, following an assassination attempt by Jewish terrorists, in which Mayor Bassam Shaka of Nablus lost both his legs and Mayor Karim Khalaf of Ramallah lost a foot, a group of Jewish Nazis gathered in the campus of Tel Aviv University, roasted a few cats, and offered their meat to passers-by as shish kebab from the legs of the Arab mayors. Anyone who witnessed this macabre orgy, as I did, would have to admit that some horrors defy explanation in the present state of knowledge. End of note. As a matter of fact, no political figure or group of any political color in any country had predicted even vaguely the horrors of Nazism. Only artists and poets such as Heine were able to glimpse some of what the future had in store. We do not know how they did it, and besides, many of their other henchers were wrong.